This book titled And the Witnesses Were Silent is written by Wolfgang Gerlach, and it's about the German evangelical church during the 1920s and the 1930s and how it aided Hitler in coming to power. I want to give it a read. It's extremely hard to find. I only found like 2 or 3 copies that were very expensive, and I got one. None of them are new. They're not printing it anymore, as far as I can tell. Anyway, I want to give this a read. This is part 3. However, if you haven't been here for the other parts, I will explain this as though you're like a beginner. I'll explain things as we go, so let's give this a read. This is almost at the end of chapter 2. A legislative foundation for persecution. Some in Germany insisted on viewing the events of April 1st as the spontaneous action of fervent Nazis and a harmless expression of public opinion. If you're just coming into this, there was a big boycott against Jewish stores and things on April 1st, inspired by the Nazis, 1933. It was after Hitler had already come to power, and it was just before any anti-Jewish legislation really started hitting hard. Things got ugly. People were beaten to death. The news in the outside world, outside Germany, was reporting on how Jews were being treated heavily. And the Germans within Germany were lying and claiming that it was basically outrage propaganda against Germans, when it wasn't. They were genuinely hurting Jewish people, obviously. Since the boycott was not written law, they maintained, there was no official policy of persecution against the Jews. Within 1 week of the boycott, however, the legislative foundation for such a policy had been laid. The Reich Law for the restoration of the professional civil service. This is the basis for basically the entire struggle in the Christian church, this law that we're about to read here. This is like the first anti-Jewish legislation that was passed. Nearly, is pretty close to the first. In contrast to the church laws that followed, this Reich Law is seldom reprinted. Because of its relevance to our subject, essential passages, including its statutes of implementation, are quoted here. This is an extremely uncommon thing to find. Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service, April 7th, 1933, Section 3. 1. Civil servants who are not of Aryan extraction are to be retired. Insofar as honorary civil servants are concerned, these are to be dismissed from their offices. In a minute, as we'll talk about, the church adopted this legal framework into its own system. So this Reich Law that they're laying out here would eventually go on to be called the Aryan paragraph in church law. And it was the basis for everything. So this is actually pretty important. Number 2, paragraph 1 does not apply to civil servants who are already civil servants on August 1st, 1914, or who have fought on the front in the World War for the German Reich or for its allies. So it's saying, like, anyone who fought on the front lines in World War I, they're allowed to continue as civil servants. In the case of the German evangelical church, this meant that they couldn't be in ministry. Like, they couldn't be pastors, or they couldn't have any important role in the churches at all, deacons or anything. However, that obviously eventually moved to they're not allowed to be involved in the church at all. I think that was like by 1934. It was all very fast how it happened. And finally, they just weren't allowed to, like, live, obviously. So the whole thing is about Jews who converted to Christianity, not about Jews, or who have fought on the front in the World War for the German Reich or for its allies, or whose fathers or sons were killed in action. Further exceptions can be authorized by the Reich Interior Minister in agreement with the responsible departmental minister, or abroad by the highest regional authorities for civil servants. Or abroad. I guess that'd mean like ambassadors or whatever, embassy workers. First decree on the implementation of the law, April 11th, 1933, Section 2. 1. Whoever is descended from non-Aryan, particularly Jewish parents or grandparents, is considered non-Aryan. It is sufficient if one parent or one grandparent is non-Aryan. This is to be assumed particularly if one parent or one grandparent has belonged to the Jewish religion. Again, we've talked about this in other parts, but Aryan, in their minds, meant anybody who were from the tribes that would eventually constitute Germany. So basically white people who were originally like German, from the German area, Saxons and things. Jews were not originally Germanic, but they were white. Since they weren't Germanic, they're considered non-Aryans. white people in the United States and Britain are generally considered to be from the Germanic tribes. We speak a Germanic language. English is Germanic. It's sufficient if one parent or one grandparent is non-Aryan. This is to be assumed particularly if one parent or one grandparent has belonged to the Jewish religion. If a civil servant was not a civil servant as of August 1st, 1914, he's required to prove that he is of Aryan descent, a frontline soldier, or the son or father of a soldier killed in action in the World War. Proof is to be furnished through the presentation of official documents, birth certificate and marriage certificate of the parents, or military papers. So with this law, Germany set up a condition in which Jews were rushing to prove that they were part of German culture, that they were Germans, and turning in their birth certificates so that a list could be made of the people who have Jewish descent but are no longer involved in it, thus making it child's play to identify people who are on the fringes but not fully Jewish. And of course, fully Jewish people who have two Jewish parents or are involved in it to any degree are reasonably easily identifiable already because they have like lists, through the census and things. This is part of Germany's attempt to create lists of Jews, and it worked. 3. If Aryan descent is in question, then an expert opinion is to be procured from a specialist in racial research appointed by the Reich Interior Minister. A specialist in racial research. Wow. What a phrase. Third decree on the implementation of the law, May 6, 1933, Section 3. 1. The stipulations for descent in Section 3 also apply to the descendants of extramarital relationships. So if your dad was Jewish, but you never even knew the guy, you were raised Catholic, your mom's Catholic, your whole family's Catholic, and you were adopted by like a Catholic stepfather, you're still Jewish in their mind. Law against the overcrowding of German schools and universities, April 25th, 1933. This is a really big one that caught a lot of attention of the outside world. During the enrollment of new students, it must be observed strictly that among the total number attending each school and department, the number of Reich Germans who are not of Aryan descent, as established by the law for the restoration of the professional civil service of April 7th, 1933, which is the Aryan paragraph, it's what we read a minute ago, does not exceed the percentage of non-Aryans in the population of the German Reich. The numerical proportion shall be determined uniformly for the entire territory of the Reich. 2. Likewise, in the reduction in the number of pupils and students pursuant to Section 3, a commensurate relationship between the total number attending and the number of non-Aryans is to be established. In this case, a higher proportion deviating from the numerical proportion can be established as a basis. Wow, that was like a lot of unnecessary language. The bottom line is that this law made it so that Jews couldn't attend colleges or universities anymore. Not really. I think they just lowered the proportion in this, but it would eventually, and pretty soon after, go on to completely ban them. Number 3, preceding paragraphs 1 and 2 do not apply to Reich Germans of non-Aryan extraction whose fathers have fought at the front for the German Reich or for its allies, or to the offspring of marriages contracted before the effective date of this law if one parent or two grandparents are of Aryan origin. Nor shall these groups be considered in the computation of the numerical proportion and the numerical relationship established in paragraphs 1 and 2. God, this language is crazy, the way that they're phrasing all this stuff. So they made an exception for people whose parents fought in World War I, basically is what that means. That's the end of the Reich laws on the subject. The laws against Jews in the professions contained the same restrictions. Since the total number of Germans working in professions outside the civil service was greater than those within it, the percentage of non-Aryans exempted from the new restrictions was higher in the private sector. By the time this law came out, Hitler was already in power and had already wielded his power in a dictatorial way. Like, he'd already implemented the Enabling Act, which effectively gave him the power of a dictator. And the church, the Catholic Church, and the Protestant churches, or the Federation of Protestant Churches, the German Evangelical Church, they all set this up as rules within their little system. Again, these churches at best, like the ones that defended Jews, didn't care about Jews. They cared about Christian converts from Judaism. That was the whole bit. It says the proportion of people exempted was higher in the private sector. This law, to my knowledge, didn't even apply to the private sector. This is about civil service. This is about like working in government in some way. But the churches and private companies instituted this rule to show their support of Hitler, who, by the way, was not commanding support yet. People did this before it was even necessary. In 1933, 336, or 47%, of the 717 non-Aryan judges and state attorneys could retain their positions, as well as nearly 70% of the 4,505 non-Aryan lawyers, and 75% of the 45,000 non-Aryan doctors serving in the public health insurance system. Wow. Even Nazi Germany had public health insurance. Jeez. Get it together, America. Although the proportion of non-Aryan students affected by these decrees was smaller, anti-Semitism among teachers in some schools was so virulent that the Prussian Minister for Culture and Science, Bernhard Rust, issued a call for order in May 1933. Prussia was its own empire originally, I believe, and then it was like a German state for a while under the German federal government. Bavaria, Belgium, they were also German states at the time. Prussia was a German kingdom that existed from 1701 to 1918, was a major factor in the unification of Germany in 1871. Prussia is not a German state anymore. Prussia is no longer an active political entity in modern times, but rather a historical region comprised of parts of the modern-day nations of Germany, Poland, and Russia. There you go. So Prussia used to be part of it, but no longer. Noting that some school directors had already excluded students of non-Aryan descent and even citizens of foreign countries, Rust announced that such procedures are not permissible and insisted that those students unjustly excluded be immediately readmitted. So even people that were in support of the Nazi Party, which is an awful lot of people by this point, recognized how bad this was. The Reich Law for the restoration of the professional civil service did not affect the clergy, religion teachers, or theological faculty. Yet, like the school directors admonished by Rust, there were already some Protestants who believed that the church should voluntarily comply with the new Aryan regulations. In the spring and summer of 1933, however, the German evangelical church had other concerns. At this point in time, it was very much like what we have. The environment is very much like what we have in America right now. I'm not saying Trump is Hitler at all. I don't believe that. But the environment was one in which Christianity had integrated politics into it seamlessly. Like, when you find like an evangelical Christian in the United States, they have this weird obsession with the flag and not disrespecting the flag, not burning the flag, not kneeling for the flag, praying and saying under God when you say the thing in the flag, or when you say the Pledge of Allegiance, all that other stuff. They've implemented, or they've integrated politics seamlessly. And that was very much what happened here. So that's why there was so much debate about whether the church should integrate the Aryan laws into their church rules and doctrines. The Reich Church, or what would eventually be the Reich Church, was a federation of Lutheran and Reformed church, like a Calvinist denomination. And it was like very much separate from the rest of the world, although they did communicate with and work with other denominations similar to them in the outside world, like other Lutheran churches. The Catholic Church was not based in Germany. So the Pope worked really closely with Hitler for a long time and was even close enough to him to get Jehovah's Witnesses banned because they spoke negatively about Catholics. Catholics didn't like that. They talked to Hitler. He banned them. But Catholics were less supportive of the Nazi movement than the evangelical church. Although they were still supportive. They still eventually, by this point in time, 1933, the Catholic Church instructed their bishops and their everybody all the way down the line to swear an oath of allegiance to Hitler. Again, before it was necessary, before they even had to. All right, let's continue. The Reich Law for the restoration of the professional civil service did not affect the clergy, religion teachers, or theological faculty. Yet, like the school directors admonished by Rust, there were already some Protestants who believed that the church should voluntarily comply with the new Arian regulations. In the spring and summer of 1933, however, the German evangelical church had other concerns. A movement to unite the regional churches into a national Reich church was gaining support. Different factions were maneuvering behind the scenes to select the first Reich bishop and seize the leadership of the various regional churches in the first national church elections. Underlying all these developments was the burning issue of whether the Church of Jesus Christ should alter its doctrine to conform to racial ideology. The position of the German Christian faith movement was clear. It was now up to the rest of the German evangelical church to take a stand. So, being predominantly a denomination or a version of Lutheranism, they followed certain creeds. They call it like confessions. The Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, so on. They're basically just like a description of their beliefs. Like, the Trinity exists, you can be saved if you come to Jesus, so on and so forth. And the big debate was whether the Arian paragraph broke the confessions. Eventually, they came to determine that it did, or many of them did. Like, 2,000 to 4,000 pastors out of 18,000 concluded that it did, in fact, violate the confessions. But it didn't matter. It had been centralized. The power was centralized in the church by that time, and the confessing church had no power. Chapter 2, Early Church Statements. Despite its silence about the April 1st boycott, there were early signs that the church would resist any attempt to alter church law. On May 5th, 1933, the regional church government in Kassel sent a statement to the Central German Evangelical Church Committee in Berlin, titled, "To the Conscience of the Evangelical Church." It deplored the fact that the church and its members, like professional associations and organizations, private clubs and lodges, sportsmen's and private garden clubs, had succumbed to the pull of Nazi Gleichschaltung, the synchronization of all levels of German life to bring them under Nazi control. The authors recognized that regulation of the Jewish question was clearly being carried out on the basis of the 1920 National Socialist Party program. From the church's perspective, the most important section of the 1920 program was Article 24, which protected religious freedom as long as it didn't conflict with the manners and moral sentiments of the Germanic race. Basically, it's saying, from the church's perspective, they didn't really care what Germany did as long as it didn't conflict with the church's goals or rules. One of the first to see through Article 24 had been Hermann Sass, the former editor of the church yearbook. The clear-sighted Kassel church officials agreed with Sass and appealed to the consciences of their fellow Christians. The evangelical church must be reproached strongly for not putting an end to the persecution of its own children in the faith. Indeed, for giving its blessing from the pulpit to those who are working against its own children in the faith, and for banishing people of the same faith with whom they joined in worship before the church's very doors as though they were mangy dogs. We're watching the early formation of the confessing church, the oppositional group to Hitler, within the church. Again, it was not very big at its height. The letter described the official party distinction between Jews and non-Aryans. Protestant or Roman Catholic Christians whose parents or grandparents were either practicing Jews or had converted to Christianity were considered non-Aryan. According to the party, even non-Aryans baptized as Christians were Jewish. In the terminology of the time, blood comes before faith, quote-unquote. It was ultimately a struggle between, is Judaism a race or a religion? Hitler believed it was a race. The church believed that anybody who came to Jesus could be saved, whether it's a race or not. The concern of the Kassel letter was limited to members of the evangelical church, baptized Jews, and the so-called non-Aryans. By the way, non-Aryan included black people. They didn't target them to such an intense degree, but it did include them. Anyone who wasn't from the Germanic tribes. The Kassel writers believed that observant Jews were being cared for sufficiently by their own religious community. Jews were still allowed to practice their faith in the synagogue. Non-Aryan Christians, however, had been left on the church's doorstep. Quote, "Why is it," the scripture, "not valid for those who are Jews according to birth and belief? Because these Jews, in contrast to the non-Aryans and baptized Jews so degraded today, have one genuine consolation. They can pray to their God in their church. They have a religious community that helps them bear their trial. In the prayer that their priests taught them, they can call upon their God to whom their fathers prayed in difficult times. Though the material and spiritual injury endured by these German citizens, banished and rendered second-class human beings because of their blood, be ever so great, they have the right and the opportunity to pray to their God. You know, they're talking about, like, Jews who converted to Christianity all through this, but they're not even considering Jews that are being attacked, who can't, like, the synagogues being destroyed, burned to the ground and everything. They don't even care. This is nuts. They have their communion before God. They have their holy sanctuary in their temple in which they can pray. They trust in the foundation of their faith. With the non-Aryans, it is different. Like the Jews, they are excluded from the ranks of full citizens of the state. But in the church to which they belong, they seek consolation in vain. The evangelical church to which they belong, the faith in which they were baptized, confirmed, and married, the church that wanted to prepare them for the path to God, that same church expels them by meekly tolerating their expulsion from the ranks of fellow believers. God is held up as the partisan defender of a group defined by blood. Where shall the Protestant non-Aryan, where shall the Protestant Jew find hope and faith? The answer is nowhere. As we'll talk about later, they eventually went on to order Jews to create their own Christian congregations if they converted to Christianity. They couldn't be part of regular Aryan services at all. And finally, Germany was just declared free of Jews, quote unquote, I think in 1937, somewhere in there, through extermination or through sending them to forced labor camps. That was the end of the quote from the Castle Church document that was written. The letter. The Castle writers called their church government to account because it had declared its solidarity with the party and the state and sought racial separation instead of confirming the bonds of faith. I've said this previously, but this was fundamentally a battle about whether separation of church and state should exist. People kept bouncing back and forth when it was convenient. That was like one of the biggest issues here. If they had all picked a side, it may not have played out the way that it did. That goes for Catholics and the confessing church and German evangelicals, all of it. Finally, the Castle writers attempted to arouse the church's conscience on behalf of the Jewish and non-Aryan brethren. Quote, this is another part of the letter. Despised and proscribed, betrayed by their own church, robbed of their God, they also stand before the collapse of their material existence. Not because they may have worked against God, not because they have revolted against the state, against Vulcan fatherland, not because they were criminals and deceivers, not because they were political enemies of other comrades, but only because their own brothers and sisters in the faith expelled them from God's promised community due to a drop of blood, and disowned the confession of their evangelical Christian faith, because their Führer, which means leader, it was Hitler, their Führer because their church encouraged them to do so. They were referring to the confession. Which confession violated this? It was the confession that described that anybody can come to Jesus. I don't remember which one that was. Apostles' Creed or Nicene Creed or one of them. 1 week after the Castle petition, in the Niederdeutsche Kirchensendung, the Young Reformation movement published its principles regarding the reorganization of the evangelical church. The 7th point stated, quote, we confess our faith in the Holy Spirit, and therefore we reject as a matter of principle the exclusion of non-Aryans from the church. For this is based upon a confusion of state and church. The state has to judge, the church has to save. Fascinating, like they're calling it out. They're pointing out the church melding with the state. One response to this statement came from a non-Aryan Christian, a district court director named Cello. His statement illustrated the perspective of someone directly affected by the new measures. Cello distinguished between those born into the church and those who had been baptized as converts, or in the attempt to seek refuge. In light of the increasing numbers of illicit baptisms, he warned, the church must be wary of opportunistic proselytes. So this guy was complaining that some Jews were just joining for protection. Fascinating. Yet the church could not treat non-Aryan members who'd been baptized as infants differently from its Aryan members. This is particularly important since the break with Judaism has not only a religious effect, but for devoutly religious people means separation from the Jewish community, which likewise has its roots in congregational life, quote unquote. Sello assumed that only the state was trying to implement the Arian paragraph. He failed to see that the church had already fallen into a maelstrom of complicity with state-decreed hostility toward Jews. So the guy basically, it's saying that Sello underestimated the degree of hate for Jews, not just in state, but also in church. Amid the general euphoria of the early months of National Socialism, or Nazism is what that is. Nazism is an abbreviation for National Socialism. So amid the euphoria in the early months of Nazism, the Castle statement went unheard. In contrast, the young Reformation movement, because of the prominent names associated with it, could count on more attention, particularly since a theological truce still prevailed within its ranks. Nonetheless, the multitude of groups, associations, brotherhoods, and assemblies paralyzed the willingness of many individual Christians to make a decisive commitment. In the end, the different movements neutralized one another. So there was some opposition to how German converts to Christianity were being treated, but the euphoria of the Nazi movement neutralized the complaints, and there was just a stalemate. Of the various statements published on the question of the non-Aryan Christians in 1933, some were clear and unmistakable. Old Testament scholar Wilhelm Vischer delivered an important lecture before the Conference of Brethren in Lippe on April 30th, 1933. The organizers of the conference had asked, does the Old Testament still have guiding significance for Christians at present? You can see it moving slowly. They're presenting the arguments and trying to justify implementing a rule where Jews are not allowed to be involved at all. They're trying to scrub Judaism entirely in any way from Christianity, which is effectively impossible to do, since Christianity is like a child religion of Judaism, right? So it starts out, they implement the Arian paragraph. They're banning Jews from being involved in ministry at all. And then it moved to, we're scrubbing the Old Testament of any mention of Jews. And then it moved to, we're getting rid of the Old Testament entirely. And I'm jumping ahead here, but I'll tell you what happened next. Then it moved to, Jews are not allowed to be part of Christian churches at all. They have to create their own Christian churches and operate that way. And then it moved to, we're going to change the New Testament to completely erase any mention of Jews, now that we've gotten rid of the Old Testament from our Bibles. And we're going to spread the idea that Jesus was not Jewish. That's kind of the chain of events. And we can see it playing out here. So they've banned Jews from having a part in ministry, and now they're talking about getting rid of the Old Testament. I mean, some of these things are correct. The Old Testament doesn't have strong relevance to Christianity today because it's a child religion, and Jesus fulfilled the old law. That's why we don't, have a problem eating pork or shellfish or whatever other thing. But they weren't doing it for those theological reasons. They had what's called motivated reasoning. It's bad faith. They had a goal in mind, and they were going toward that goal as quickly as possible, any way they could get there. We want Jews completely scrubbed from our religion. How do we get there? The organizers of the conference on April 30th, 1933 asked, does the Old Testament still have guiding significance for Christians at present? Protesting the very notion of separating the New Testament from the Old, Vischer replied, the tribe of the Jews from which Jesus comes cannot become one nation like other nations, even after the crucifixion of Jesus. The history of the Jews is a special mystery of God. With the Jews, God desires to fulfill the work of reconciliation begun with the calling of Israel. Romans 9:11. I find it super fascinating to review the verses that were used to make these arguments at the time. Romans 9:11 was a big one. Also Romans 13, I believe. And later on, they also made arguments using Ephesians 4:15 through 16. Anyway, they reference Romans 9:11 here. The Jewish question is therefore not a racial question, but a question about God. Although Vischer could have confined himself to an Old Testament analysis of the question, as most of his Old Testament colleagues did at the time and later, he did not evade the Jewish question. He even appended a short article on the Jewish question to his remarks, since a participant at the Conference of Brethren had suggested that I could have kept this offensive addition to myself in an otherwise so edifying lecture on the enduring significance of the Old Testament. In this appendix, Vischer elaborated on his remark that the Jewish question concerned the mystery of God, which human beings could not unveil by escaping into intrinsically racist solutions that could only lead ad absurdum. He wrote something in this document, but just a quick reminder because I didn't remember who this was. Wilhelm Vischer was an Old Testament scholar who wrote on this subject to the conference on April 30th, 1933, like the General Conference for the Christian Federation of Churches. So he was trying to add expert opinion to the church leaders' decisions. And this was his appended message to them. Quote, "Does not the hatred that breaks forth repeatedly from both sides indicate that the roots of the Jewish question lie deeper than in racial distinctions? Whoever wanted to insist that the Jews might be a race distinct from the Germans, and therefore that the Jewish question might be a racial question, would be arguing as facetiously as a husband who, in experiencing difficulties with the wife joined to him in wedlock, now wants to claim that he's experiencing the woman question because his wife is a woman. The relationship of the peoples of the world to the Jews is something fundamentally different from, for example, the relationship of white Americans to Negroes." That's really interesting. So he's basically saying that this is ridiculous and that Jews are no different than anybody else and they shouldn't be treated differently, effectively. By the way, if words in here are offensive, I apologize. I feel it's incumbent on me to just read it as it's written. The book is, 50, 60, 70 years old, and it's about a subject that's over 100 years old now, or around 100 years. So you're going to find offensive stuff in here, but for the sake of posterity, I'm going to read it as it's written. Several other noteworthy statements from 1933 show that Vischer's perspective was shared by others in the church. An appeal from student youth, it's in italics, so it was a document. An appeal from student youth demanded that everyone without distinction as to status and race can be a member of the church. The testimony and confession of Westphalian pastors, with 100 signatures, headed by that of Pastor Ludwig Steele, who later died in Dachau, I think it's how it's pronounced, which is a concentration camp, a death camp, for his opposition to Nazism, repudiated the equation of the mission to the Jews with the mission to the Gentiles because of Israel's position in salvation and eschatological history. Eschatology being like your beliefs in the apocalypse, in the end times, what's going to happen. So it's saying, just to kind of break it down here, because it's kind of confusing. So at this conference that included representatives of all the different non-Catholic churches in the area at the time, a number of different church leaders wrote opinions to be considered by the leaders of the Federation of Churches, the German Evangelical Church as a monolith. And this church, led by Ludwig Steele, wrote a document that basically said God does not differentiate between Jews and Gentiles in the body of Christ, effectively, is what I'm reading here. And he died in Dachau for his opposition to Nazism, because of Israel's position in salvation and eschatological history, and he condemned every division of the church that seeks the separation of Jewish Christians from Gentile Christians. The Tecklenburg Confession observed that the German Christians' theological treatment of non-Aryan Christians undermined the validity of sacraments. Don't forget, when it says confessions, it's talking about, basically church laws, expectations. So I believe there's a Barman confession, which we'll eventually get to, and that kind of created the confessing church. So the Tecklenburg Confession, it says here, observed that the German Christians' theological treatment of non-Aryan Christians undermined the validity of the sacraments. Quote, "Through the exclusion of Jewish Christians from the German church after they have given up their fatherland for the sake of Christ, the sacrament of baptism is distorted and destroyed. In the wish to admit those who are racially different only as guests to the Eucharist, this sacrament is destroyed as well." They're basically outlining some of the main complaints from people leading up to the confessing church splitting off from the Federation of church is known as the German Evangelical Church. These are a few examples. Despite these various proclamations, most within the church were occupied with church matters, quote unquote, and dealt only marginally with the church's Jewish members and the Jewish question. Nonetheless, two prominent professors spoke out, Martin Buber to his fellow Jews and Professor Hans Ehrenberg, who, as a non-Aryan, would himself fall victim to the Aryan paragraph, to Christians. At a time when German Jews are confronted by the universal fate of the Jews, Buber summoned his fellow believers to face this confrontation faithfully, that is, through suffering. What happens to us, even if it strikes us in our very marrow, is not decisive. What is decisive is how we conduct ourselves with regard to it, what we make out of it, what it makes out of us. Buber insisted on loyalty to our calling, a commitment to solidarity with the one who cannot be named, dependence on the one who binds. The important fact that this hour is a test for Christianity has nothing to do with us. What matters to us is that it is an ordeal of fire for Judaism. Wow, interesting. So he was a non-Aryan. Well, so he was Jewish, basically, I assume. And he would fall victim to the Aryan paragraph, eventually. Yeah, he was Jewish. Summoned his fellow believers to face this confrontation faithfully. So it sounds like this guy believed that what was happening to Jewish Christians was right, that it was righteous, and it was intended by God to punish them for being born Jews, I guess. It was a fire for the race, quote unquote. In his 72 guiding principles on the Jewish-Christian question, Hans Ehrenberg, the same guy, acknowledged that the times were trying for Christianity as well. The Bochum pastor, author of important scholarly Gutachten, or expert opinions, especially on the topic of the church in Israel, had influenced the confession of Westphalian pastors mentioned above. Now he successfully reminded the Reformation Church of the relation between Judaism and Christianity. Remember, the Federation of Churches was mostly Lutheran, but there were some Reformation members. It was a Calvinist denomination. In my mind, when I think Calvinist, I think people who believe in predetermination, like everything is already planned out before you're even born, basically. That's kind of one of the defining features of the religion, if you will. Anyway, so I guess the people from the Reformation section of the Federation were reminded of the links between Judaism and Christianity. Jews and Christians, he wrote, were interrelated and dependent on each other, for better or worse. Christianity was a question for the Jew. Judaism was a question for the Christian. If the conflict inherent in these questions was detached from Buber's one who cannot be named, or God, obviously, the point of reference for each tradition was lost. If Jews and Christians replaced their differences of belief with hatred, or temporarily united in common cause against a third party, the non-Aryan Christian, then the guilt of both would be immeasurable. Ehrenberg's theses appeared in the summer of 1933, shortly before the bitter debate about the Aryan paragraph broke out within the evangelical church. Proposed by the German Christians and their supporters at the September 1933 National Synod being like an assembly. When it was proposed by German Christians at the September 1933 National Synod, the Aryan paragraph barred everyone of non-Aryan extraction or who is married to a person of non-Aryan extraction from the ministry. Non-Aryan extraction was defined according to the provisions of the Reich laws that excluded non-Aryans from civil service. So the church adopted the Aryan paragraph. And from day one, before it was even necessary, they debated it. They talked about it. They believed that it should be implemented. The controversy over the Aryan paragraph ignited the German church struggle, or the Kirchenkampf, and threatened to split the German evangelical church. Today, some scholars find it inconceivable that after Ehrenberg's pioneering witness, there could be any debate about the Aryan paragraph at all. It's inconceivable that the confessing church, which is the opposition to Hitler, of course, with its document in hand, was unable to find a saving word for Israel. End quote. Ehrenberg had set the standard for his church in Thesis 59. Quote, "The Church of the Reformation in Germany stands or falls in 1933 on the temptation to separate the Jewish Christians, completely or in part, from itself. In the final phase of the church conflict, the Jewish-Christian question will be the symbol and heart of that conflict." End quote. Next one is about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. That is absolutely bound to be fascinating. It's effectively laying out the groundwork for the creation of the confessing church, the opposition to Hitler. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was number 2 in the confessing church, which is probably what the next chapter is going to be about. Second in command to Niemöller, who was number 1. The point of this chapter, if I had to find one, is that there was dissent and support for the Aryan paragraph. And there were theologians and philosophers and scholars debating whether Jews should be allowed to be involved, or what influence Judaism should have on Christianity. These debates weren't happening outside of Germany, really, which we'll talk about more in another part. Outside of Germany, other Lutheran churches and Reformation churches were really unhappy with what was happening with their denomination. They effectively split off into a new denomination, which is the German Evangelical Church. This is really interesting to me to see the arguments being presented at the time and see how it compares to today.